Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today, folks. You sent us a whole bunch of philosophy articles, and now we're diving headfirst into the world where law and language, well, they kind of get tangled up. It's more complicated than you might think.
It really is. I mean, at first glance, you'd think law and language are like best buddies. After all, lawmakers use words to make laws, right? And then we use those same words to figure out what the laws mean. But the deeper you go, the more you realize it's not that simple.
That's what we're here for, to untangle that mess.
Yeah.
And one of the articles you sent pointed us to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on law and language. And wow, it really highlights how legal philosophy and the philosophy of language are like totally intertwined. They both grapple with the whole shebang of meaning, interpretation, how we even communicate in the first place.
Yeah, they're like two sides of the same coin. Legal philosophers, they're obsessed with how language actually works in the legal system. How do words written on paper turn into real-life rules that, everyone's supposed to follow? And that question takes us straight back to some of the heavy hitters in philosophy, like Jeremy Bentham, for instance.
Bentham, yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia article mentions him as a real pioneer.
Yeah.
Like he was super focused on trying to ground law in something, well, something more concrete, empirical, observable. And that led him to this really interesting sign theory of law.
Oh, yeah. Bentham was all about clarity, like super precise. He really thought that a law, at its core, it's just a collection of signs, words, really. And those words are expressing, like, the will of whoever's in charge, the sovereign power. But here's the kicker. He thought those signs, those words, they only make sense if they're talking about real things you can see and touch. Like, he wanted to ditch all the abstract stuff and get right down to what a law actually does.
So basically, no fancy language, no grand speeches, just straight up, this is what you got to do, and if you don't, bam, punishment. It's pretty pragmatic, to say the least.
It is, but of course, people had issues with this idea that a law is just like a bunch of signs pointing at things in the real world. Can we really reduce all laws to something so simple?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what about all those laws that have, evolved over time through court decisions and precedents, common law offenses? There's no single rule book for those. And even with laws that are written down, aren't they still relying on a bunch of unwritten norms and principles to give them weight? It's like there's this whole unspoken layer of understanding that goes beyond what's literally on the page.
Right. And this thing the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up, the idea of tacit commands, it tries to explain that unspoken layer, like maybe a ruler can create a law just by, being silent, as if their will alone can make a rule happen. But then that just leads to more questions. Can silence really have meaning if there's no context, no shared understanding beforehand? It's like trying to understand a painting that's just a blank canvas. There's nothing to interpret.
So we keep hitting this wall. Law can't just be words, no matter how carefully we choose them. There's always something more that gives them power, makes people feel obligated to follow them.
You've hit the nail on the head. That something more is where things get really interesting. The Stanford Encyclopedia suggests that maybe laws are more like standards of behavior communicated through language and sometimes even created by language. But even that idea runs into trouble when you think about how slippery legal interpretation can be.
Ooh, slippery slopes. It makes me think about that case, Garner v. Burr, which the article talks about. It's the one where a guy gets in trouble for pulling a chicken coop on wheels down the road. And the big question is that chicken coop a vehicle, according to the law, that says vehicles need pneumatic tires? It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it brings up a fundamental question about how we interpret even the most basic legal terms.
Totally. Garner v. Burr, it's a classic example of how a simple word can turn into this huge legal battle. In that case, the magistrates, they said, nah, a chicken coop on wheels isn't what the law meant by vehicle. But the appeal court, they came in and said, hold up. The whole point of this law is to protect the roads, and those iron wheels could totally damage the road. So in that specific context, boom, the chicken coop became a vehicle.
It's crazy how much power a single word can have in the legal system. But this case also shows what the Stanford Encyclopedia calls the paradox of legislative language. How can people who speak English perfectly, who all understand the same language, disagree so strongly about what a law means and how it should be applied? It's like we're all reading the same script, but putting on totally different plays.
Right. And the key to that paradox is understanding the difference between semantics and pragmatics. So semantics is all about the literal meaning of words, like the dictionary definition. But pragmatics, that looks at how meaning changes depending on the context. In Garner v. Burr, everyone knew what vehicle meant in the dictionary, but they couldn't agree on what it meant in the context of that specific law and its purpose.
So context is king, as they say. But this just brings up even bigger questions about law itself.
Mm.
If it's more than just the words used to express it, where does its authority come from? Is it just a back and forth between lawmakers and the people they govern, or is it something deeper, something that goes beyond language?
And that, my friend, is a question that has been keeping legal philosophers busy for a long, long time. And it's one we'll keep wrestling with as we keep diving deeper into this fascinating world where law and language collide. It's funny how a case like Garner v. Burr, the chicken coop on wheels, can make you think so much about legal language. Like we were just talking about how important context is and how it can change the meaning of a word like vehicle. But there's something else we need to talk about too, and that's evaluative language.
Evaluative language. You mean words that are like opinions or judgments? I can see how those could get tricky when we're talking about law. I mean, aren't laws supposed to be objective, not based on someone's opinion?
That's the idea, right? To keep things impartial. But, a lot of legal terms, even the ones that seem pretty straightforward, they actually have these hidden value judgments baked into them. It's like there's this whole layer of assumptions and values underneath the words themselves.
So even trying to define a simple word like vehicle can turn into a moral debate.
Well, think about it. In Garner v. Burr, deciding if that chicken coop was a vehicle or not, it wasn't just about checking a dictionary. They had to think about the purpose of the law, protecting the roads. But they also had to consider, the whole idea of keeping criminal law clear and understandable. If we start stretching the meaning of vehicle too far, then who knows what could end up being banned from the roads.
So even in a case that seems pretty black and white, there's this gray area where values and interpretations sneak in.
Yeah.
Like the law is asking us to make judgments about what's fair, what makes sense, and, what fits with the spirit of the law, not just the letter of it.
Exactly. And this actually challenges a really big theory in legal philosophy called the sources thesis. This idea, which was really pushed by a philosopher named Joseph Raz, it basically says that all law is based on sources. Like you can trace any law back to some objective fact about society without needing any moral arguments or subjective values.
But what you're saying is that this Garner v. Burr case, with its chicken coop vehicle situation, kind of throws a wrench in that theory.
It definitely makes things more complicated. If we can't even agree on what a vehicle is without thinking about the values behind the law and what it's trying to achieve, then it seems like those values, those judgments, are already built into the law itself. It's like trying to separate the ingredients of a cake after you've already baked it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, laws are made by people, and people are driven by their values, right?
Yeah.
Even when we're trying to be totally objective, our beliefs and values are always going to shape how we see the world, including the legal world.
That's it. And this raises a really interesting question. How do we balance the need for law to have objective sources with the fact that subjective values are clearly part of how we interpret those laws?
It's like trying to grab a hold of a cloud. You know it's there, but as soon as you try to touch it, it disappears.
Perfect analogy. And this tension between the objective and the subjective, it's something that really keeps legal philosophers thinking. But you know what else keeps them up at night? Vagueness.
Ah, yes, vagueness, the enemy of clear thinking. I think we've all been there trying to understand something that's open to a million different interpretations.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the law, that lack of clarity can have real consequences, right?
Absolutely. Vagueness in legal language, it creates all sorts of problems. It makes it hard for people to know what the law actually wants them to do. And it can lead to different people being treated differently under the same law. It's like trying to use a blurry map to navigate a maze. You never really know if you're going the right way.
Can you give us some examples of how vagueness shows up in actual laws?
Sure. Think about terms like careless driving or reasonable doubt. Those are really broad terms, and they're meant to cover a wide range of actions or situations.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Lawmakers can't think of every single possibility, right?
Yeah.
They need to leave some room for the law to adapt to different circumstances.
Exactly. But that flexibility comes with a trade-off. It can create these borderline cases where it's not clear if something actually breaks the law or not.
It's like that philosophical puzzle, the paradox of the heap, where you take away one grain of sand at a time and you have to ask, at what point does it stop being a heap? There's this fuzzy line that's really hard to define.
You're right. That paradox really shows how some concepts are just inherently ambiguous. And when those concepts end up in the law, it can make things really unpredictable and uncertain. It's like the law is speaking in riddles.
And if the law is a riddle, how can we be sure it's being applied fairly and consistently? It seems like vagueness just opens the door for people to be treated unfairly or differently than someone else in the same situation.
That's a really important point. Vagueness in law makes us question the whole idea of the rule of law. If the laws that are supposed to guide our actions are unclear, does that mean judges can decide cases based on their personal opinions, instead of a clear objective standard?
That's a bit worrying. Doesn't that undermine the whole point of having laws in the first place? To treat everyone equally and predictably.
It's a valid concern, for sure. And that's why philosophers spend so much time thinking about what vagueness means for how judges make decisions. Some argue that judges are always looking for the right answer, even when the law is vague. But others say that vagueness just gives judges more power to make decisions that aren't really based on the law itself.
So is vagueness in law like necessary evil? Do we just have to live with it to have flexibility, or should we be trying to make laws as clear and precise as possible?
Tough question. And it's one that legal systems around the world are constantly struggling with. On the one hand, vagueness does give us flexibility. It allows the law to adapt to new things that lawmakers might not have even thought of. But on the other hand, too much vagueness can undermine the whole idea of a fair and impartial legal system. It's this delicate balance, trying to be clear and predictable while still being flexible enough to handle new situations.
Sounds like legal interpretations like walking a tightrope, trying to stay true to what the law says while also figuring out all the little gray areas and applying it fairly in real life.
Yeah, I like that. Lawyers and judges, they're trained to deal with all this complexity, to untangle the vague parts, and to apply the law in a way that makes sense, both based on the words and the bigger purpose and principles behind those words. It's not just about knowing what words mean in a dictionary, it's about understanding the spirit of the law, why it exists, and what values it's trying to promote.
This deep dive is really making me see law in a whole new light. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of rules. It's about this whole dance between language, interpretation, context, and, the whole pursuit of justice.
That's a great way to put it. And as we keep digging deeper, we'll see how this dance plays out in even more interesting ways. Like, we'll come back to Bentham and his quest for perfect definitions, and we'll explore how philosophers have tried to explain the very essence of legal obligation. How do words on paper turn into rules that have real power over our lives?
So we're back for more deep diving. And man, we've been going deep into this world where law and language kind of get all mixed up, and it's way more complicated than I think either of us expected. I mean, we've seen how even a simple word like vehicle can cause a huge legal fight, and how vagueness in legal language, well, it can be both good and bad.
It's true. It's like we've been peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer reveals something even more complex underneath. We started by wondering if law was just a bunch of signs pointing at things, like Bentham thought, and now we've seen how all this stuff, context, purpose, values, it all plays a part in shaping what legal language really means.
And something that really caught my attention in the Sanford Encyclopedia article was this idea that Bentham, even though his way of defining legal terms was sometimes, well, maybe a bit too simple, he was actually onto something important.
Yeah, I think he was. Even if he didn't nail down the perfect definition of law, he definitely pointed us towards a huge question in legal philosophy, the question of law's normativity.
Okay, now you have to explain that. Normativity of law. What does that even mean?
So basically, it's about figuring out how law actually obligates us, how it makes us feel like we have to do certain things and not do other things, how it tells us what we should do, not just what is allowed. It's like the ought of law.
I get it. So it's not just about describing the legal system. It's about trying to understand why we feel bound by it, even when we might not agree with every single rule.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of normative language comes in. Words like must, right, obligation, prohibited. Those words, they have a certain force, a weight to them. They're not just describing facts. They're telling you what you're supposed to do or what you absolutely can't do.
So if we can figure out how this normative language works, maybe we can understand how law actually has power over us.
That's the hope. And of course, philosophers have come up with different theories to explain the normativity of law, looking at it through the lens of language. Bentham, he was all about focusing on the concrete stuff, so he tried to explain those normative legal terms like duty in terms of punishment. He basically said, your duty is to do whatever you'll get punished for if you don't do it.
So it's all about the stick, no carrot. Obey a law because you're afraid of what'll happen if you don't, not because you actually believe in it.
Well, that was Bentham's take. He saw the law as a system of rewards and punishments meant to make people behave a certain way. But as we've talked about, that view is kind of, well, oversimplified. It doesn't really explain the difference between a robber demanding your wallet and a legal duty to, say, pay taxes.
Right. I mean, we wouldn't say we have a duty to give our money to a robber, even though there are definitely bad things that could happen if we refuse.
Mm,
So there has to be something more to legal obligation than just fear.
right. You got it. And that's where another big name in legal philosophy comes in, H.L.A. Hart. He wasn't buying Bentham's whole command theory. He thought it missed this important part of legal obligation, this internal aspect, and he actually used the work of a philosopher of language, J.L. Austin, to develop his own theory, a practice theory of rules.
Wait, so a philosopher of language helped us understand law. That's wild. Tell me more about that.
So Hart's idea was that social rules, including legal rules, they're more than just patterns of behavior backed up by threats. There's also what he called a critical reflective attitude, which is like this shared understanding that the rules are standards for how we should act and we can criticize people who don't follow them.
So it's not just about being forced to obey. It's about actually believing in the rules, seeing them as valid reasons to do things, even if we might not agree with them all the time.
Exactly. And Hart thought that the way we use normative language shows this. Like when you say you must stop at a red light, you're not just predicting what will happen if someone doesn't stop. You're saying that there's a good reason to stop, and that reason comes from the law itself and the fact that we all agree, as a society, to accept its authority.
Wow, this is making my head spin a bit, but I think I'm starting to get it. So the normativity of law, that feeling of obligation, it's not just about external pressure or being scared of punishment. It's about this deeper internal acceptance of the rules as reasons for acting, reasons that we all share. It's like this unspoken agreement to play by the same rules, even when we don't always like the outcome.
That's it. And Hart's theory, with its focus on language and how we actually use it in social situations, it's been hugely influential in shaping how we think about law and why we feel obligated to follow it.
This whole conversation has really opened my eyes. It's amazing how these philosophical debates about language, which can seem so abstract, actually have a huge impact on how we understand something as real and powerful as the law.
It all comes back to the power of words. Lawmakers use language to create this whole world of rights, duties, and consequences. But like we've seen, the relationship between those words and the law itself, it's not simple at all. Context matters, words can be slippery, and judges have to figure out how to untangle all the different meanings.
So next time we hear a legal debate, we should really pay attention not just to what people are saying, but how they're saying it, and how they're using those words to build their arguments, make decisions, and shape how we understand this legal world we all live in.
That's the key. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving.